Welcome back to Cameroon. This morning I'm tying a synthetic baitfish using mostly SF Fibre. This is something I've made for the tigerfish here. It can be moved really fast without destabilizing. The sky's the limit in terms of the number of colors you can use, and you can do it really sparse. So especially with synthetics, if you tie them in sparse, they go quite translucent in the water. That just gives a bit of an impression of a baitfish rather than a hard profile. So the fish don't get as much time to look at it. They just lock on the eyes and wreck it. It's quite versatile. It doesn't have to be used on tigerfish at all. Also a great fly for garrick in the salt. I'm sure it'll work great for jacks and other crevalle species as well. The materials I'm using are a Tiemco 600 SP hook. That's just because I'm fishing it for tigerfish. If you are using it in the salt, you can go with a Gamakatsu SL12 or something similar, whatever your favorite is. I'm using a few different colors of SF Fibre today. So today I'm using one called Rainbow, one called Camo, Bleeding Red, and Natural. Then I have some tan Bucktail and stick-on eyes. So once again, as with the brush fly, I'm using Nano silk to tie. So I'm going to add a little bit of super glue to the shank before starting the thread. This just gives a very nice base to work off, just because Nano silk loves to slip all over the place. I'm going to start with a clump of bucktail. In this case, I don't really want it to flare too much. So I'll use the kind of bucktail you might use for clousers, probably from near the top of the bucktail. You want this to be 3 or 4 times the length of the hook shank. Right, now I'm going to take some SF Fibre. In this case, it's the color is called Natural. It's like a really pale aquamarine, really nice color. Take a clump of this, quite a sparse clump, and I'm going to fold it in half. Then measure it. You want it to be just slightly longer than the bucktail. Trim some excess. And now before I tie it in, I like to spread it slightly like this, just so that it wraps around the hook shank a little bit. I kind of want this to enclose the bucktail. For this first clump, I'm not folding it back. Right, now I'm going to take another clump of the natural SF. This one will be even sparser than the first. Going to fold it in half. Fold it in half again. Tease it out, just to taper it. You never want straight lines in your flies, or very seldom anyway. And now I'm going to tie this in underneath. I'm going to tie this in with about 2/3 of this clump facing backwards. And then fold the rest back and tie it down. You can see we're already creating quite a nice taper to this tail. Clean up and move the thread forward to about 2/3 of the way along the shank. Let's call it there. Now I'm going to take another color of SF. In this case it's called rainbow, presumably because it's the color of small rainbow trout. Going to take a clump of this, fairly sparse, but much like the first clump I did for the tail. Fold it in half. Now this time, before I tie it in, I'm going to just tease out the ends to taper it once again. When you only fold it in half once, only one end needs to be tapered. The other end will naturally be tapered, which is great. Now I'm going to tie this in so that the new clump extends to just shorter than the tip of the tail. Tie that down a bit. That ends up being, I think, about 2/3 of it facing back, 1/3 facing forward. Now I'm going to take more natural. Once again, sparse clump. Half. Half again. Taper. Technically you should only have to taper one end because the other end will taper at the same time, but I find it just works better to do both. Turn fly over and tie this in underneath. This clump you're tying in right in the center of the clump. Right, now tie these both down really hard and make sure that the front of where they're tied down is even on both sides. It's quite important. Now we're going to fold these back, get your thread in front of them. And dam up a bit of thread in front. You can bullet tie them. If you are doing quite a skinny baitfish, you don't want a broad profile, then you can just right away come and tie them down like that. In this case, I will dam up thread instead. I want it to be slightly broader today. Now, because Nano silk is slippery, when I dam up thread, as soon as I've got my taper right, I'm going to put some super glue on the thread and just do a few more wraps there, just to make sure nothing slips around. Nano silk is amazingly strong, but it is horrible to work with in terms of the way it slips around. So you just have to take your wins with your losses. Now I'm going to take a really small amount of this red. I mean, you can almost count the fibers on 2 hands. I'm going to fold this in half and half again. Taper it slightly if you need to. Trim off any egregiously long fibers. And now I'm going to tie this underneath, tie it in the middle of the clump, and kind of to the side underneath. 2 or 3 wraps. Take the clump around to the other side. Tie that down hard. In this case you are bullet tying it. Now you're going to come right to the front here. Take a clump of take a clump of rainbow SF again. Quite a sparse clump, because I'm actually going to add another color to it in this case. So a clump of rainbow and then a clump of camo SF. Just a small amount. Adding a small amount of this camo is just going to bias the last clump of rainbow slightly towards olive. It'll be like a super pale olive. Just blends colors really nicely into each other. Lay your 2 clumps on top of each other. Fold in half. And half again. And then you're going to taper. Okay, once you've done that, you're going to tie this in right at the front of the hook, just behind the eye. You want about 1/3 of the clump facing towards the tail of the fly and 2/3 towards the front. Once again, you can see I've flattened this slightly just so that it folds around the hook shank. Do a couple of wraps, make sure that this is evenly spread around the hook shank. Cinch it down hard, right behind the hook eye. Now work this backwards. Get your thread to the front, and you're going to dam up some thread here. Once again, damming the thread rather than bullet tying will give you a slightly different taper. Also, to finish a fly with, dammed thread will give a much nicer looking head. You can see that's tapered really nicely. A couple of stray fibers which I'll trim just now. Once again, once I've finished damming the thread, I'm going to add super glue to the thread and just finish off like that. Now I'm going to take stick-on eyes, in this case silver. Make sure to scratch the adhesive off the back of them. A lot of the time when the eyes won't stay on the fly, it's because the adhesive is not off the back, and so the glue is not actually stuck to the fly, and so they just fall off. So I like to clean the backs. You can also do this with isopropyl alcohol and a rag. That's the best way to do it, but I'm in the bush here, so I'm just going to use my thumbnail. Bit of super glue. Make sure you don't get super glue right to the edges of the eye, because otherwise it will stick to your fingers and it becomes really frustrating. Going to want to press this eye down hard for a good 20 seconds.
A few moments later.
That's one.
One eternity later.
And two. Now you can just look for any stray fibers. I think I've done a fairly good job here. And that is now a really nice natural baitfish.